On the very morning Kendra Hayes was meant to step into history as the first black female chief of police in a deeply divided town, she was pulled over by two white officers who saw only her skin color and not her authority. And that moment, born of fear and arrogance, ignited a storm they never saw coming. What began as routine intimidation unraveled into a seismic reckoning for the entire department as Kendra, calm yet unyielding, revealed her identity not with rage but with righteous power. Now, as word of the stop spreads, the town braces for a new era. But when she walks into the precinct and confronts her entire team face to face, the question isn't whether Cedar View will change, it's who will survive the change she's bringing. Certainly. Here's the expanded version of Chapter 1, The Stop. Now developed into approximately 2,500 meaningful words, it builds upon the original scene with greater depth, character insight, tension, and subtle world-building. The morning sun had just begun to spill its golden light across the winding stretch of highway that curved into Cedar View, painting long shadows across the asphalt. It was one of those early spring mornings where the coolness in the air hadn't yet been chased away by the sun, and the silence of the road lent itself to reflection. Behind the wheel of a modest black sedan sat Kendra Hayes, her posture poised, yet stiff with anticipation. Her dark brown hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, though her face betrayed none of the nerves dancing in her chest. Her navy blue suit was neatly pressed, her hair pulled into a tight, elegant bun. A small leather case sat on the passenger seat, containing a fresh badge and the symbolic weight of responsibility. Today was not just another work day. Today was supposed to mark the culmination of decades of resilience, determination, and quiet rebellion against every barrier designed to keep her from rising. Her first day as chief of police. She had rehearsed this drive in her head more times than she could count, imagining what it would feel like to cruise into the department lot as the new top officer, how she might be received by those who supported her, those who doubted her, and those who outright resented her appointment. She had read their names, their histories, their internal memos. She knew Cedar View's police department wasn't welcoming the idea of her leadership with open arms. Some made that known during closed-door meetings. Others didn't need to speak at all. Their silence was its own protest. The town itself had a reputation, charming to outsiders with its white picket fences, weekend farmers markets, and seasonal parades, but to those who looked beneath the surface, Cedar View had long stood on the wrong side of social progress. The population was majority white, its leadership historically male, and its law enforcement historically resistant to any suggestion of reform. She tried to focus on the horizon, on the rising sun casting its golden hue across the tops of trees and rooftops, but even the warmth of the morning light couldn't soften the edges of the town's past, or her own memories of driving through neighborhoods like this, stomach clenched, palms sweating for reasons that had nothing to do with weather or road conditions. She had worked tirelessly to reach this point, but even now, as she neared the city limits, a tight ball of unease sat squarely in her chest. The traffic light ahead turned from green to yellow. She eased her foot onto the brake, slowing to a stop just as the signal turned red. Her mind wandered briefly to the meeting scheduled for 8 a.m., her official introduction to the department, and the speech she had prepared. She would be calm, firm, professional. They would see her authority in her poise, in her presence. She had never been one to raise her voice to be heard. Instead, Kendra let her work do the talking. Then came the flash, those all-too-familiar flickers of red and blue reflecting in her rearview mirror like ghosts from a darker chapter. The siren came next, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the silence and her thoughts like a blade. Her stomach dropped. A patrol car was pulling her over. She instinctively glanced at the speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. The car was registered, inspected, insurance up to date. Nothing to warrant a stop. Yet, as always, logic played second to fear when it came to roadside encounters. She exhaled slowly and pulled to the side of the road, her tires crunching over gravel and dry grass. Her hands stayed visible on the wheel. This wasn't new. It had happened before, too many times before. The doors of the patrol car opened and two officers stepped out, both white. One older, tall and broad-shouldered with a stiff gait that suggested seniority or long years on the force. The other younger, perhaps late 20s, with a trimmed buzz cut and a swagger that carried the careless energy of someone still trying to prove himself. The senior officer approached on her driver's side, posture firm, eyes scanning her vehicle with deliberate slowness. He carried himself like a man used to being obeyed without question. The younger one lagged just behind, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed in evaluation. Kendra lowered her window, the cool air brushing against her face as she turned to meet their gaze. She said nothing yet. Let them speak first. License and registration, the senior officer said. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't polite either. It was mechanical, routine, too routine. Like this was just another day of pulling over someone they didn't expect to belong here. Without a word, Kendra reached into her glove compartment and retrieved her documents, moving with deliberate care. Every motion, slow, visible, non-threatening. Years of training and years of living had taught her exactly how to navigate moments like this. Moments where a wrong assumption could spiral into danger. She handed over the license and registration. The officer took them without acknowledgement, glancing briefly at the name before passing them to the younger officer who had stepped closer to the car. "What brings you out here this early?" the younger one asked, his tone less curious and more suspicious. Kendra looked at him calmly. "I'm on my way to work." The younger officer raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. "Oh yeah? Where exactly do you work?" She paused. She could have ended this entire charade with a single word, chief. But something inside her stopped her, something quiet but resolute. Not yet. She wanted to see this play out. She needed to know how far they would go, what assumptions they would make, how they would treat someone they didn't recognize, someone who looked like her, someone who, in their eyes, didn't belong. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied, keeping her voice steady and composed. There was no aggression, no defensiveness, just quiet assertion. The young officer didn't appreciate the answer. He leaned in slightly, the smirk faltering just a little. "Let's not get clever. We can take this further if need be." And there it was. The shift. The warning wrapped in civility. The threat wrapped in policy. Kendra had seen this tactic before. Hell, she had studied it, written about it, trained others to avoid it. The use of institutional power to provoke submission. The senior officer, who had remained silent, now took a step closer, a slight furrow forming between his brows. His posture tensed, and the dynamic changed again, this time darker. Kendra drew a breath, her resolve tightening. That was enough. She reached slowly down to her waist and unclipped her badge, raising it just enough for them to see. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice carrying an unmistakable weight now. "I'm Chief Kendra Hayes. As of this morning, I'm your commanding officer, and I strongly suggest you rethink how you've chosen to handle this stop." The silence that followed was deafening. The senior officer froze, his eyes widening just slightly, then narrowing again as confusion battled with dawning recognition. The younger officer's confidence drained from his face. His smirk vanished, replaced by something closer to disbelief or panic. "You're the chief?" the older man asked, the stiffness in his voice cracking just a little. "Yes," Kendra said, her tone clipped and firm. "And I'd like to know why exactly I was stopped. What, specifically, did you observe that gave you reasonable suspicion to initiate this stop?" There was no answer. She stepped out of the vehicle, standing tall on the shoulder of the road. The morning sun caught the edge of her badge, now clearly visible at her hip. Her stance was deliberate, composed, the posture of someone who had learned to carry power without having to announce it. Both officers stood rigid. Stripped of their usual control, they suddenly looked small. The dynamics had flipped, and they knew it. "This isn't just about me," Kendra said, her voice unwavering. "This is about every black driver you've stopped without cause, every time you've let suspicion outweigh reason, every time your assumptions spoke louder than your professionalism." The younger officer opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He looked at the senior officer, silently pleading for direction. Kendra didn't wait. I'll be reviewing every stop you make for the next few weeks, she continued. Every report, every complaint, every dash cam. So if this is how you operate on a quiet weekday morning, I can only imagine what happens when you think no one's watching. The senior officer swallowed hard, then tried to salvage control. We didn't mean any disrespect, Chief. Kendra's gaze didn't waver. I'm not looking for apologies. I'm looking for change. This department is going to be held accountable starting today. You're both on notice. The older officer gave a stiff nod, and the younger one dropped his gaze, suddenly very interested in the toes of his boots. The power in the moment wasn't loud, wasn't forceful. It was steady. It was Kendra's quiet strength that pinned them there, forcing them to face the consequences of what they thought was just another routine stop. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to threaten. She was already in charge. Silence enveloped the roadside like a shroud, heavy and thick, muffling even the distant hum of traffic. The senior officer stood motionless, his eyes blinking rapid fire as though trying to reboot his brain from the shock of the moment. The hesitant rhythm of the world seemed to pause. The younger officer, who had walked up with arrogance and assumption, now wore an expression of stunned confusion, his earlier smirk gone as though washed away by a sudden realization. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Words fled them, leaving only the fluttering of Kendra's calm breathing in the air. You're the chief. The senior officer's voice cracked, betraying his attempt at calm. His tone held a mixture of awe and disbelief, as though her identity tore away at everything they believed about how things worked in Cedar View. Yes, Kendra replied, her voice crisp and clear. The words weren't loud, they didn't need to be, but they carried authority. And I'd like to understand the reasoning behind this stop. What specific actions or observations led you to believe it necessary? Gold dust from the rising sun gilded her dark uniform and badge, the symbol of her new authority glinting against fabric that had earned its place through perseverance. She didn't take a step forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The shift had been made. The balance of power had tilted. Neither officer offered an explanation. Their eyes diverted but only clung to her presence, stunned. Finally, Kendra extracted herself from the car and stood beside it, visible, unwavering. She folded her arms slowly, deliberate, radiating the kind of confidence no polite apology could counterfeit. This isn't about one stop, she said. Her tone rose slightly, just enough to carry over the road's background noise. This is about the countless black people and other people of color who have been pulled over on this very road on similar mornings, under similar pretenses, those who have been cuffed, abusively questioned, treated like criminals before they even knew why. This, she gestured around, emphasizing the moment, the setting sun, the heavy air, is a reminder. The younger officer clenched his jaw, looked away, as if shielding himself from a truth that dared to blur his understanding of justice. The senior officer inhaled sharply, readying a defense, but seemed to think better of it. So he merely nodded, silent. Kendra remained still, watching him closely, as though waiting for a word that would unpack the tension between guilt and defiance etched into his posture. The pause lingered, thickening until Kendra stepped forward, closing the remaining distance. She spoke softly, deliberately, without ferocity, but with a steel bent from years of hardship and resolve. For the next few weeks, I will personally review every single stop you make, every report, every dash cam recording, every complaint filed afterward. I will want full clarity on what justified pulling someone over. This is not optional. This is now part of your duty. She paused to let that sink in. You can no longer operate behind the shield of routine, because routine here has meant routine racism, routine injustice, and that ends now. The older officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbed, he exhaled. We didn't mean any disrespect, Chief. His voice had thinned, less commanding, more cramped by regret and surprise. Kendra's gaze remained fixed upon him. Her reply was precise, unyielding. I'm not looking for your apologies. I'm looking for observable change, accountability. I want to see how you treat every individual with professionalism and impartiality. If that cannot happen, this department will not stand on your watch. That is not rhetoric. It is reality. She turned and walked back to her car, her steps deliberate and unhurried. She did not slam the door, choosing instead to close it with a quiet finality. The engine started, its hum steady. She eased forward, merging into traffic once again. With every meter between them, she carried the weight of the shift she'd initiated and the burden of every action to come. As she drove on, the town of Cedar View spread out beneath her windshield, its brick storefronts and muraled walls passing in neat progression. But something had changed. The early morning light felt different now, less welcoming, more scrutinizing. The old Cedar View, comfortable in its prejudices, had been confronted this morning, and now, under her watch, it was under review. Kendra exhaled, but her chest remained tight. The tension of the encounter fluttered in her insides, but alongside it swelled a slow, powerful calm. This was no longer just her first day in title, this was the beginning of her first day in power. And power, she had learned, was not a shield, it was a responsibility. Her phone buzzed softly, a reminder of her schedule, the breakfast meeting with local community leaders. She glanced at the time, still early. She had space to collect herself before she entered the precinct and faced staff who would surely hear of the morning's disruption before she did. Her mind flickered briefly to the officers behind. Would they conduct themselves differently when pulled over now, with eyes watching them? Would their questions be more measured, their tone more respectful? Or would they resent her presence so deeply that they'd double down, pushing harder, angrier behind the badge? These were the stakes she'd taken on. This was what it meant to carry the badge she now wore, not just to be in charge, but to change what it meant to be in charge. The road unfurled ahead, and as Cedar View's downtown neared, the morning's first traffic light blinked red again. Kendra slowed slightly, glanced in her mirror, and let a small, concentrated breath slip out. This was only the first stop. But it was a statement, and in Cedar View, statements were rarely ignored. Later that day, Kendra stood before the assembled members of the Cedar View Police Department. The precinct's briefing room, normally humming with idle chatter and casual banter in the early afternoon, felt tense as the door closed behind her. Conversations stilled, and heads shifted toward their new chief. The whispers died instantly, replaced by an almost tangible silence, heavy with curiosity and anticipation. She didn't need to demand attention. She commanded it simply by walking in, quiet confidence radiating from her, black blazer fitted over crisp uniform, badge pinned with authority. The room fell immediately still, every eye locked onto her. She heard the soft scrape of patrol boots, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and the barely audible hum of anticipation. She waited, steady, allowing the room to settle before she spoke. "I want to begin by addressing something that happened this morning," she said. Her voice was calm but carried the force of someone who had already lived through harder days. "Two of your fellow officers stopped a black woman, me, on my way to work. They didn't recognize me, but their assumption spoke volumes." A flicker of shock passed through the officers. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others stared at the floor. None dared to speak. Kendra took a slow step forward, her eyes scanning the room, landing momentarily on each face as if memorizing the reactions. "I'm not here to shame anyone," she continued, walking with purpose. Her footsteps echoed softly on the linoleum. "But I am here to change this department. If you've got biases, bring them to light. If you treat people differently based on the way they look, you won't last long under my leadership." She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence that followed felt like a held breath, stretching through the room and pressing into every mind. A few officers stiffened their spines, others shifted in their seats. There were nods from a handful, small but meaningful nods that acknowledged a truth some were only beginning to accept. This job is not about control. Kendra said gently but with resolute clarity. It's about service, and if you think your badge gives you the right to intimidate, harass, or discriminate, you're in the wrong building. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. One officer's head bobbed in a gesture of understanding, another clenched and unclenched her fists she held at her sides as a sign of solidarity. A few officers looked away or shifted uncomfortably. They didn't yet know what this day would mean for them, or how deep the reckoning would run. Kendra kept her gaze sweeping from face to face. "I've faced worse than skepticism," she said. "I've fought against systems that weren't built for people like me, but I made it here, and I won't stop until every officer in this room reflects the kind of justice this community deserves." Her presence filled the room, not as an intruder, but as its rightful leader. The crest of the police department emblazoned on the wall behind her seemed to pulse with renewed purpose, reflecting light back into the determined faces before her. She paused again, this time long enough for her intention to crystallize in the minds of those listening. Finally she spoke again, quieter, but no less powerful. "Can't or won't hold up the values of fairness, respect, and dignity, well, then perhaps this isn't the place for them." Murmurs rose, serious, focused conversations rekindling. A senior sergeant, long-tenured, leaned forward, wincing as though trying to measure her reaction. But she did not leave. She stayed present, attentive. Kendra nodded to the sergeant and to the others, then closed with a promise that resonated in the hush. "I know change can be hard, but I also know we can make this department something our community trusts and respects, not for what we say we are, but for what we prove ourselves to be. We serve them, we protect them, we are accountable to them, and from today forward, that is who we are." The room remained silent for a heartbeat before officers began to applaud, some hesitantly, others with genuine resolve. It was no thunderous ovation, but it was real. It landed with weight and promise. Where there had been quiet anxiety, hope now flickered, timid but real. Outside the precinct, word of the morning's traffic stop and the chief who had intervened quickly became the talk of the town. Community members spoke in hushed tones, then louder, as they realized the significance. A woman who had been treated like any other suspect had quietly upended a morning routine just by being who she was, eager to speak with someone, anyone, who'd been at the precinct meeting. Activists, organizers, even challengers in local government praised the moment. "Change is coming," they said. "We see it now." Social media posts shared snippets. "Chief Hayes just spoke truth to power. Merci, Chief Hayes. Finally, someone in authority who knows what accountability means." But Kendra knew better. She recognized the energy, potent, inspiring, but unstable. She didn't linger for accolades or applause. The precinct ceremony ended. Officers returned to duty, some to their patrol coats, others to paperwork and team meetings. Kendra slipped away to her office, a quiet, unassuming room with framed photos of past chiefs, a coffee maker that had seen better days, and a window overlooking a small courtyard where flags waved. She stood at the window for a long moment, watching an officer outside helping an elderly woman load groceries into her car. Her expression softened, absorbing the sight like a reminder of purpose. Her phone buzzed with congratulatory texts, some from old mentors, others from colleagues who believed this moment could echo far beyond Cedar View. She put it on silent, giving herself space to process, to breathe, to ground herself. As the afternoon light deepened, her door opened. The senior and younger officer from the morning stood in the doorway. Their expressions were cautious, naive perhaps, but sincere. "Chief Hayes," the senior officer said, voice low. He had a grasp on professionalism that he hadn't mustered earlier. I want to apologize for this morning. We were out of line. I was out of line." Kendra looked slowly at the two of them. She nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said, voice measured. "I'm glad you're here, but apologies are just words unless they're followed by action. I want to see different behavior. I'm not interested in feelings. I'm interested in change." They nodded again. "We get it," the younger officer said, awkward but earnest. We'll do better." Moments later, Kendra found herself walking them to their desks. Along the way, she told them they'd each be enrolled in a mentoring program, guidance on best stop practices, community engagement assignments. She believed in giving people a chance, in the power of education, in the idea that leaders bring people not by force, but by showing them where to go. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Kendra held listening sessions with community members, mothers, fathers, students, elders, talking about their experiences with the department, their fears, their needs. She sat across tables in strip mall community rooms, in church halls, in libraries. Each session echoed the same message: respect, transparency, reform. Internally, she launched audits of traffic stops, of complaint records, of internal messaging. She brought in trainers, facilitators, leaders from departments with better reputations, places that corners had cracked open and allowed light in. She reached out to councils in neighboring towns and states to share best practices. Resistance emerged in private conversations, in departmental memos, in the quiet isolation of certain officers who still couldn't accept that the badge belonged to someone who didn't fit their expectations. Some requested transfers, a few left, a few remained hostile, but many, many stayed. They volunteered for community ride-alongs, they attended training, they changed. The local media covered it. Profiles ran, "Who is Chief Kendra Hayes? New chief brings bold vision to Cedar View." Comment sections filled with arguments, but many, many more with encouragement. "I feel hopeful. We've been waiting for this." Finally, a voice for those left out. As weeks turned into months, the department's use of force complaints dropped. Minority community survey responses indicated increased feelings of trust. Applications for cadet positions rose, with more diverse candidates than Cedar View had ever seen. She noticed something to leave behind at her desk, a printed note hung at her workstation. "You have shown what real leadership looks like. We believe. A grateful community." One evening, after a long day of meetings, paperwork, and phone calls, Kendra stepped out onto the rooftop parking area above the precinct. The sun was dipping past the horizon. The sky flared in shades of pink and orange. She leaned on the railing, looking out over Cedar View in its twilight hush. Somewhere below, officers walked their beats. In the distance, the church bells sounded the hour. A family gathered on a front porch, laughter drifting up. She exhaled deeply, eyes tracing the town's beat patterns beyond herself. Her heart swelled with pride, and something gentler, a steady resolve. Change wasn't easy, it wasn't fast, it wasn't painless. But she had lit a spark. She had begun the long arc of accountability. And as she stood there, the sun's final glow slipping into night, she felt certain not that she had won, but that she had begun a journey worth every ounce of fight and every sleepless night. And in Cedar View, the shadows that once spoke prejudice were retreating, just a little, under her steady vigil. She turned and headed back inside, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.